On quiet nights, when the coast of New England settles into a hush, I sometimes think about the storm that reshaped everything long before any of us were born. A storm so powerful it carved new rivers, swallowed settlements, and rewrote memories in both English and Indigenous histories. Tonight, I'd like to drift back with you to the year 1635. To a coast still wild, forests still young, and skies that could change without warning. Let's settle in, breathe slowly, and wander together into the gentle mystery of the great New England hurricane, a storm almost forgotten, but not entirely gone. I often find that when I close my eyes and let my thoughts drift backward through the centuries, the first thing I notice is the quiet. Not silence exactly, but the kind of gentle, natural quiet that feels like it comes from the land itself. That's how New England must have sounded in the late summer of 1635, a calm, steady hush broken only by the sigh of wind through tall pines, or the distant roll of waves along the rocky shore. When I picture it, I see myself walking along a narrow footpath that follows the coastline. The forest on one side is dense with oak, beech, and towering white pines, their branches swaying lazily as though they, too, are half asleep. On the other side, the sea stretches out in a silver-blue sweep, reflecting the early morning light. The water seems peaceful, almost drowsy, lifting and falling with long, unhurried breaths. Back then, much of the land was still untouched, shaped more by rivers and tides than by human hands. Settlers lived in small clusters of wooden cottages or simple thatched homes, their chimneys rising like quiet little markers of life against the vastness of the wilderness. Smoke from morning fires curled upward in soft spirals, carrying the faint smell of salted fish and damp wood, but the people who knew this land best were the indigenous communities, the Algonquian-speaking nations who had lived along these shores for countless generations. They understood the rhythms of the seasons with an ease that settlers could only admire, the way the tides changed with the moon, how the birds shifted their patterns just before a weather turn, how the very air could reveal the coming of a long summer or a hard winter. Sometimes, while walking out near the marshlands, I would see small groups gathering reeds or inspecting the shoreline for signs of changing currents. They moved calmly, with practiced steps, as though the land spoke to them in a language most of us were still learning to hear. Life in those days unfolded slowly. The sun rose over the water with a warm, golden haze, and people went about their work at a gentle, unhurried pace. Children splashed near the shallows, fishermen repaired their lines along the shore, and farmers inspected fields of corn and squash, their tools resting lazily against tree trunks until needed. Everywhere I turned, there was a kind of softness, a world settling into the final stretch of summer, with warm winds drifting up from the south and the evenings beginning to carry a hint of coolness. Nothing felt out of place. Nothing felt rushed, and yet, looking back, I remember small details that didn't quite fit into the usual patterns. The tides, for instance, seemed a little fuller than usual, climbing an inch or two higher along the edges of the marsh. The winds were warmer, too, not unpleasant, just different, like a breeze that had traveled a long distance before reaching us. The birds caught my attention more than anything. Gulls wheeled restlessly overhead, shifting their flight paths as though testing the air. Even the crows in the forest seemed more talkative, gathering in clusters and calling out to one another in sharp, chattering bursts. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Summer always had its quirks, after all. The weather in New England has a way of choosing its own story from one day to the next. Still, I remember feeling a quiet curiosity tugging at the edges of my thoughts, like a soft tapping at a door. most evenings, I'd sit along the shoreline as the sun dipped low, watching the light stretch across the water. The horizon would blur into soft purples and pale oranges, and the wind would settle into a steady, thoughtful whisper. The world felt peaceful enough that I barely noticed the changes unfolding around me, but the natural world notices before we do. It always has. Looking back now, I think the land was already beginning to sense what was coming, not with urgency, but with the gentle, patient recognition that something far out at sea was beginning to stir, and though I didn't know it then, the air carried the earliest hints of that distant storm. Not warnings, exactly, but quiet murmurs from across the ocean, drifting in on the soft winds of late summer. When I think back to those days before the great storm reached our shores, I remember how small the world felt, yet how enormous the ocean seemed. News traveled slowly then, drifting between ships, passed quietly from sailor to sailor, and eventually finding its way to the scattered settlements along the New England coast. Most of what we learned about the wider world arrived months late, softened like old parchment worn thin at the edges. Still, every now and then, a piece of information slipped through the cracks sooner than expected. A wandering fisherman repeating a rumor he heard at a distant port. A trader mentioning unusual weather down in the warm Caribbean waters. A captain stepping onto the dock with a furrowed brow, saying little but carrying a heaviness in his movements. I remember one such day clearly, though nothing dramatic happened. A small ship from the south arrived in the harbor near our settlement. She was a modest vessel, weathered, but sturdy, with sails that looked as though they had seen more sun than storms. The crew moved about quietly, tending to their ropes and barrels with a tired, almost reflective air. They weren't frightened, just thoughtful. When a few of them came ashore, I overheard snippets of their conversations as I walked along the timber-planked dock. Words like rough seas, an unusual heat, and a brewing wind far down in the islands. Nothing alarming. Nothing urgent, more like polite observations of the kind sailors made every season, but something in their tone stuck with me, even if I didn't yet understand why. It was as if the ocean had passed along a message to them, and they were still trying to translate it. The next few days brought no obvious change. Life continued in its slow, steady rhythm. The tide washed over the stones in long, thoughtful strokes. The forests rustled with late summer breezes. The nightly fires burned softly behind cottage windows, and yet the air felt different. The warmth lingered longer than usual, settling over the land in a way that made evenings feel almost tropical. Some of the older folks commented on it, not with concern, but with the kind of mild curiosity you might have when a familiar place behaves a little out of character. I remember sitting with a small group near the water's edge one afternoon, mending a fishing line. A friend of mine paused, shading his eyes as he looked toward the horizon. "Strange light today," he murmured. The sky was clear enough, but the color felt heavier somehow, a deeper blue, layered with something almost metallic. I stared at it too, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what made it unusual. Even the animals seemed to notice the subtle shift. The gulls flew lower, tracing long arcs above the shoals. The ospreys circled the rivers with steady, deliberate strokes, as though measuring distances that only they understood. Their calls echoed a little louder against the trees, or maybe I was just listening more closely. At night, I sometimes found myself standing outside my cottage, watching the stars shimmer above the dark shoreline. The wind would rise and fall in soft waves, carrying a faint warmth that felt foreign for that time of year. I'd close my eyes and let it brush past me, wondering where it had traveled before reaching these quiet woods. Somewhere far to the south, beyond the curve of the continent, a storm was gathering its strength. None of us knew then just how large it would become, or how far it would travel, or how deeply its presence would be felt in the stories that followed. But nature always speaks first, not in shouts, but in small, careful adjustments. In gusts of warm wind. In restless birds. In subtle pressure beneath the skin of the air, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, I could sense, without understanding, that the wind had taken on a wandering mind of its own, as if deciding where it wished to travel next. The morning the storm finally reached us began in an oddly peaceful way. I woke to a quiet that felt slightly thicker than usual, as though the air itself had settled into a long, reflective pause. The light filtering through my small window was muted, softened by a veil of clouds that had gathered sometime during the night. Not dark clouds. Just a gentle gray, like wool pulled thin across the sky. When I stepped outside, the world felt unusually still. The tall pines stood motionless, their branches hanging with a sleepy heaviness. Even the usual songs of the morning birds were quieter, as though they were waiting, not with fear, just with an instinctive understanding that something was shifting. I walked down toward the shoreline, drawn by a sense of curiosity more than anything else. The sea was the first thing that made me pause. Its surface was smoother than I'd ever seen, a wide sheet of silver that barely moved except for slow, heavy pulses. It reminded me of a great animal breathing deeply before rising to its feet. A few other early risers stood along the rocks, looking out at the horizon. None of us spoke at first. Words felt unnecessary, maybe even intrusive. The distant line where the sky met the water had blurred into a seamless band of soft gray, and the air carried a faint, earthy scent, the kind that drifts in after rain, even though no rain had yet fallen. By midday, the first hints of the storm's presence began to show themselves. A breeze picked up, warm and wandering, brushing past our faces and stirring the tops of the grasses along the dunes. Leaves rustled with a whispery kind of restlessness, not frantic but thoughtful, like pages of an old book turning in a slow wind. Clouds thickened overhead, swelling into rounded shapes that moved with an almost deliberate grace. I remember tilting my head back, watching them drift in layered folds, each one shifting like a quiet tide in the sky. There was something mesmerizing about it, something ancient and strangely comforting. Nature was simply doing what it had always done, as the afternoon wore on. The wind grew steadier. Its voice deepened, humming softly through the forest canopy. The air felt charged, not in a frightening way, but in the way a landscape feels just before a long-awaited rain, expectant, patient, filled with purpose. By late afternoon, the world had changed. The wind pushed harder now, bending the branches in wide, sweeping arcs. The sea, which had been so calm that morning, began to heave in slow, muscular waves that rolled toward the shore like the steady heartbeat of something enormous. I watched from a sheltered spot near the edge of the woods, feeling strangely small and yet deeply connected to everything around me. The storm didn't feel angry, or violent, or malicious. It felt old. Older than the settlements, older than the tall pines, older even than the stories passed down by the indigenous tribes who had lived on these shores for countless generations. It felt like some ancient visitor traveling along a path it had taken many times before. As evening approached, the winds rose further, sweeping across the land with long, rhythmic pulses. The cottages groaned softly as their wooden beams shifted under the pressure, but they held firm, like quiet guardians weathering their own share of seasons. Lanterns inside flickered gently, their golden light swaying in harmony with the moving air. Rain finally arrived, not in sudden sheets, but in a gradual, settling drizzle that darkened the ground and softened the sound of everything. Each drop landed with a delicate tap, blending into a soothing chorus that wrapped itself around the settlement like a comforting blanket. I remember closing my eyes for a moment, letting the wind brush across my face, letting the rain cool my skin. Despite the growing strength of the storm, I felt calm, almost lulled by the rhythmic push and pull of the elements. It was as though the world had slipped into a slower heartbeat, inviting anyone who listened to breathe along with it. As night fell, the storm reached its full presence, not crashing down, but bending low across the land in a deep, resonant sigh. The wind roared softly like distant waves rolling endlessly. Trees bowed in long, graceful arcs. The sea surged and retreated, as though engaged in some timeless conversation with the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and in the midst of it all, there was a strange kind of serenity. A feeling that the storm was simply passing through, fulfilling its ancient route, touching the coast as gently as such a massive force could. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the winds began to ease. The rain softened. The deep rumble of the sea grew quieter. The storm, having made its long journey northward, started to drift away, leaving behind the lingering scent of salt, pine, and fresh earth. And just as gently as it had risen, the great storm began to loosen its grip, drifting onward into the vastness of the night. When dawn finally came, it arrived quietly, almost shyly, as though uncertain whether the land was ready to wake. I stepped outside before the sun had fully lifted, and the first thing I noticed was the smell, a clean, earthy scent that filled the air like a cool breath after a long sleep. The storm had washed everything, from the tallest pine needles to the smallest grains of sand along the shoreline. My boots sank slightly into the softened ground as I walked. Rainwater clung to every surface, beating on leaves, collecting in small puddles along the path, and dripping gently from the eaves of cottages. The world felt newly made, as if the storm had not damaged the land so much as pressed a reset button. Leaving behind a landscape fresh and unburdened, mist clung to the trees in thin ribbons, weaving in and out of the branches. It moved with a gliding softness, brushing along the forest floor as though searching for a place to settle. I remember breathing it in, feeling each exhale grow slower, deeper, more peaceful. There was no rush, no movement. The whole world seemed to be stretching after a long, heavy nap. Down by the shoreline, the sea looked different than it had the day before, gentler now, subdued, its surface rippling in small, thoughtful patterns. Bits of driftwood and sea grass lay scattered along the rocks, arranged in the way only a great storm can arrange things, naturally. Unplanned, but strangely beautiful. It felt like the ocean had left quiet little reminders of its visit, tokens placed carefully along the shore. A few others emerged from their homes, stepping out cautiously at first, then slowing as they, too, absorbed the quiet beauty of the morning. We exchanged soft greetings, nothing more than nods and murmured words, as though even our voices might disturb the fragile peace left behind. The forest, which had swayed so wildly the night before, now stood in a kind of reverent calm. Branches bowed with leftover rain, and small birds hopped between the roots, inspecting the damp ground with fresh interest. Even the wind had settled into a simple, gentle hum that brushed lightly across the land. As I walked further along the path, I noticed how the storm had shaped the world in subtle ways. A few fallen branches here and there, pools of water shimmering in the uneven dips of the earth. Leaves pressed flat against the ground like soft carpeting. Nothing felt broken, just rearranged, as though nature had taken a moment to tidy her home in her own sweeping, powerful way. I found myself pausing often, listening to the faint sounds that gradually returned as morning warmed the air. The distant croak of frogs. The soft trickle of water slipping off rocks. The gentle cluck of chickens emerging from their coops. One by one, little threads of life began weaving themselves back together. And somewhere above, hidden behind a slowly lifting veil of clouds, the sun began to cast its first warm rays across the treetops. The light reached down in soft, golden fingers, touching the earth with the kind of warmth that feels like reassurance. A silent promise that the world, after all its upheavals, continues moving forward. Looking out across the fresh, windswept landscape, I felt a quiet gratitude settle into my chest. Storms come and go, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle, but morning always returns. And in that first light after a storm, the world feels more honest, more open, as though we're seeing it the way early settlers and indigenous peoples once saw it, raw. Peaceful, alive. I took a slow breath and let it out again, the kind of breath that feels like it reaches all the way to the bottom of the soul. The land around me seemed to breathe with me, rising and falling in unison, grateful for the stillness after the storm's long visit, and as the sky brightened, I knew that this morning, this soft, washed clean moment, would linger in my memory far longer than the storm itself. In the days that followed, the memory of the great hurricane slowly softened, fading into the gentle rhythm of daily life. Storms, no matter how powerful, always leave behind more than broken branches and scattered debris. They leave impressions, quiet ones, in the way people talk, the way the land smells, the way the air feels long after the clouds have drifted away. I spent much of that week walking the familiar paths through the forest and along the coast, noticing small changes that revealed themselves only when I paused long enough to look. A young sapling bent at an angle it hadn't leaned before. A patch of earth newly exposed where the roots of an old tree had lifted. Fresh sand swept far up onto the grassy dunes, as though the ocean had reached out for a moment and then gently pulled away. None of it felt like damage. More like the marks left by a long, wandering visitor who had passed through and reshaped the world in quiet ways. People in the settlement spoke softly about the storm, though seldom with fear. Instead, they talked with a sort of quiet awe, about the long night of rain, the restless winds, the strange, glowing light that had lingered behind the clouds before dawn. They shared stories in calm voices, remembering how the cottages had creaked like old ships on water, how the trees had bowed as if greeting the storm's passing body. Every now and then, someone would smile faintly, almost sheepishly, as if surprised at how peaceful it had felt in the moment, despite the storm's great size. Strong winds can shake the world, but sometimes they steady the spirit. The indigenous people along the coast viewed the storm through an even older lens, not as an unexpected event, but as part of a long pattern that stretched back through generations. When they spoke of it, there was no urgency in their tone. Only understanding. Acceptance. A deep familiarity with the ways of earth and sky. One afternoon, I visited a small clearing where the forest opened toward the water. The storm had swept a few branches off the tall pines, leaving sunlight to pour through in a soft, dappled glow. The ocean shimmered in the distance, its surface calmer now, moving with slow, rhythmic breaths. It felt as if the entire landscape had taken a deep sigh, the kind released after a long-held tension. As I stood there, I realized something simple but reassuring: the storm had not just passed over us, it had reminded us of our place in the world. Small enough to be humbled by the sky. Strong enough to endure what it brought. Connected enough to feel the land shift and settle around us. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm hues of peach and gold, I found myself sitting along the same rocks where I had watched the horizon darken days before. Now the light danced across the water, soft and golden, touching everything with the gentle glow that comes only after the world has been washed clean. I would close my eyes and listen to the birds returning to their usual flights, to the soft chatter of neighbors rebuilding fences and gathering fallen limbs, to the distant murmur of waves brushing against the shore. All of it blended into a peaceful, lulling melody, the kind that makes you breathe slower, deeper, as if nature itself is humming a bedtime tune. What struck me most, though, was how the storm had changed not the land, but the way I saw it. The pines felt taller. The sea felt older. The earth beneath my feet felt solid and familiar. Like a worn path I had always known but hadn't truly noticed. Even now, when I look back on that summer of 1635, I remember the storm not as a single violent moment, but as a long, wandering breath of the natural world, powerful, yes, but also strangely kind. It came. It swept the land. And it left behind a quiet that settled into every corner of memory, and whenever I smell the sweet, rain-washed scent of a forest after a long storm, or watch clouds drift in heavy, layered shapes across the sky, I am taken back to that time, a time when the sky bent low, the sea rose high, and the world felt both fragile and beautifully alive. And so, as I let these last thoughts drift like fading ripples across a quiet inlet, I find myself returning to the same simple truth that has echoed through every part of this story. That the world we inhabit has always been shaped not only by the hands of people, but by the slow, patient breath of nature itself. The great hurricane of 1635 left its mark on shorelines and memory alike, yet what lingers most softly is the sense of connection, the way distant lives, small wooden houses, pine forests, and quiet coves all became part of a larger, ancient rhythm. A rhythm we can still feel today, if we listen closely enough. As you settle deeper into rest, let the remnants of this old New England tale drift outward like lantern light on calm water. Let the wind of centuries past soften into a gentle hush. And allow yourself to drift peacefully into sleep, knowing you've traveled far without ever leaving the comfort of your pillow. Thank you for listening, and may your night be calm, your dreams gentle, and your mind at ease.